Concrete slammed against rubber as Crosby dropped the weights. He was 400 pounds of bad intentions, staring down a man half his size. "You can't move a mountain," he laughed, a heavy, wet sound. 3 seconds later, his boots left the floor. This wasn't magic. It was physics. Fluorescent bulbs hummed above the sparring mats, a low, persistent buzz that drilled right into Bruce's right temple. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the faint throb of a migraine beginning to nest behind his eyes. He didn't want to be here. A converted warehouse on the industrial edge of town, smelling sharply of wintergreen liniment, stale cigar smoke, and years of dried perspiration embedded deep into the canvas. It was a Tuesday evening, damp and unforgiving. Adam Alvarez stood by the ring apron, chomping on an unlit cigar that looked entirely too big for his mouth. Adam was a promoter who saw martial arts not as a discipline, but as a circus act. He dealt in spectacles, in broken boards and shattered bricks, in men screaming to break the tension of a room. Bruce despised the theatrics, yet here he was, standing in his flat-soled canvas shoes, acutely aware of the charade. His own ego, a jagged, imperfect thing he constantly tried to sand down with philosophy, had dragged him onto this mat. Across from him stood Crosby Dawson. Crosby wasn't just large, he was an architectural anomaly made of dense, pale flesh. 400 pounds of ex-collegiate lineman who had spent 3 years in Hawaii studying sumo before realizing there was more money in mainland exhibition matches. He was a mountain of a man, his center of gravity resting somewhere around his knees. He breathed through his mouth, each exhale whistling slightly through a historically broken nose. "Look at him," Adam muttered, leaning over the ropes, the synthetic fabric of his cheap suit rustling loudly in the quiet gym. "Dawson hasn't been moved off his spot since 1961. You sure about this, kid? The crowd paid for a fight, not to watch you rupture a disc." Bruce ignored the promoter. He kept his eyes on Crosby. The wrestler was currently powdering his hands with chalk, the white dust clouding around his massive thighs. Crosby wore a modified canvas belt wrapped tightly around a waist that was wider than a standard doorway. His calves were the size of artillery shells, heavily corded with thick blue veins that pulsed with every step he took. When Crosby finally stepped onto the center mat, the plywood beneath the foam padding audibly groaned. Cynicism hung in the air, thicker than the chalk dust. The audience, a ragtag assembly of local boxers, skeptical weightlifters, and a few journalists looking for a joke to print, leaned forward in their folding metal chairs. They wanted Bruce to fail. They wanted the small, wiry man who spoke of water and formlessness to hit the immovable wall of American mass. They trusted gravity. They trusted iron and stake. They didn't trust kinetic energy, leverage, or the mechanics of chi. Bruce felt a familiar, irritating flutter in his stomach. It wasn't fear. It was deep, profound annoyance. He was tired of explaining himself. His back ached subtly from a sparring session the day before, a dull tightness radiating down his left lumbar. He wasn't a deity of combat today. He was just a 30-something man with a headache, staring at a giant who smelled of sour milk and ammonia. "Whenever you're ready, lightweight," Crosby rumbled. The giant lowered himself into a traditional sumo crouch, feet planted impossibly wide. He slapped his enormous thighs, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous warehouse. "Try to budge me. I'll even let you get a grip." Bruce took a slow, deliberate breath. The air tasted of rust and dust. He felt the familiar, dangerous pull of anger. "Don't meet force with force," he reminded himself, though his jaw clenched tight enough to grind his molars. The human impulse was to show off, to strain, to scream and pull until a muscle tore. That was exactly what Crosby wanted. Crosby wanted a tug of war. Instead, Bruce walked forward. His footsteps were silent. He felt the texture of the canvas through the thin soles of his shoes, cataloging the slight depressions in the padding where heavy bags had been dropped over the years. He stopped 2 feet from the human boulder. Up close, the sheer volume of Crosby Dawson was suffocating. Radiating heat rolled off the giant's skin. Bruce could see the individual drops of moisture clinging to the coarse blonde hair on Crosby's chest. The man's eyes were small, buried under heavy brow ridges, glinting with a smug, unbreakable confidence. "You're standing too straight," Bruce said softly. His voice lacked the theatrical boom Autumn always begged him to use. It was quiet, conversational, almost bored. Crosby barked a laugh. "I'm anchored, buddy. 400 pounds. You weigh what? $1.40 soaking wet? You couldn't lift my leg." Bruce didn't smile. He looked down at Crosby's stance. He didn't see a 400-pound monster. He saw a physics equation. Mass, fulcrum, center of gravity, base of support. Crosby was strong, undeniably so, but his confidence made him rigid. Rigidity was death. Rigidity was a dry branch waiting to snap under pressure. "Are we putting money on this, Adam?" a voice called out from the darkness beyond the ring lights. Someone chuckled. Ice clinked in a glass. Bruce tuned them out. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the uneven beat of his own heart. He let the annoyance wash through him and drain out through his heels. He didn't need to be stronger than Crosby. He just needed to be smarter than gravity. Time in the ring always possessed a strange, elastic quality for Bruce. As he stepped into Crosby's personal space, the ambient noise of the gym, the coughing, the creak of folding chairs, Adam's heavy breathing, seemed to stretch and distort, fading into a low, oceanic roar. He reached out and placed his hands on Crosby. The physical contact was jarring. Crosby's torso was like a damp oak barrel. Bruce's hands, calloused and rough from years of striking wooden dummies, slid over the wrestler's rib cage before finding purchase on the thick canvas belt wrapped around Crosby's waist. The coarse fibers of the belt dug into Bruce's fingertips. He could feel the dense, unyielding wall of abdominal muscle beneath the layer of fat. Crosby was braced, his core locked down tightly, turning his entire body into a single, massive block of concrete. "Nice grip," Crosby mocked, his breath washing over Bruce's face. It smelled of old coffee and metallic adrenaline. "Now what?" Bruce didn't answer. He was busy calibrating. He shifted his stance slightly, feeling the way the canvas gripped the rubber of his shoes. He moved his right foot forward, slipping it just between Crosby's massive tree trunk legs. He wasn't preparing to pull. Pulling was a fool's game. If he pulled, he was fighting Crosby's weight plus the friction of the floor. Instead, Bruce lowered his own center of gravity. He bent his knees, dropping his hips until they were a fraction of an inch below Crosby's. It was a deeply uncomfortable position, straining the already tight muscles in his lower back. A sharp twinge flared in his lumbar spine, a physical reminder of his own limitations. He gritted his teeth, forcing the pain into a small, dark box in the back of his mind. "He's gonna blow a hernia," someone muttered from the crowd. Adam leaned closer, his cheap cologne, a nauseating mix of synthetic musk and alcohol, drifting over the ropes. "Come on, kid. Just give it a tug and we'll call it a draw. Don't embarrass yourself." The words barely registered. Bruce was entirely focused on the microscopic adjustments of his skeletal structure. He tightened his grip on the belt, wrapping his knuckles inward, locking his wrists. He pressed his chest against Crosby's massive stomach, eliminating any empty space between them. Crosby felt the shift. The wrestler frowned, his smug expression faltering for a microsecond. He tried to drop his weight even further, pressing down against Bruce. There it is, Bruce thought, the reaction. Crosby was pushing down. He was committing his force downward, locking his knees, sinking his hips. He was fighting the anticipated upward pull. He was trying to be heavy, but Bruce didn't pull up. Not yet. Instead, Bruce stepped in deeper, his lead knee pressing directly against the inside of Crosby's thigh. He twisted his hips, an almost imperceptible rotation that completely changed the angle of engagement. He wasn't acting as a crane anymore. He had turned his entire body into a wedge. Crosby's eyes widened slightly. The massive man suddenly realized that his downward force had nowhere to go. Bruce had slipped completely under his center of gravity. "Wait!" Crosby started to say, his voice losing its arrogant rumble. Bruce didn't wait. He unleashed the kinetic chain. It didn't start in his arms. His arms remained locked, acting merely as cables binding him to the mass. The movement started in the floor. Bruce pushed his feet violently into the unyielding plywood beneath the mat. The energy traveled up through his calves, igniting the dense muscles of his thighs. He thrust his hips forward, sliding his center of gravity directly beneath Crosby's. It was the exact same biomechanical principle used to uproot a deeply buried fence post. You don't just pull, you pry. Bruce's spine straightened with explosive speed. He drove his shoulder up and forward directly into Crosby's sternum while simultaneously pulling the heavy canvas belt toward his own hips. The contradiction of forces was violent. Crosby was pushing down. Bruce was driving forward and up. The sheer physics of it created a devastating lever. Bruce's hips were the fulcrum. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The world hung suspended. Bruce felt the immense, terrifying resistance of 400 pounds of dead weight bearing down on his joints. His knee screamed, his shoulder burned. The tendons in his wrists felt like they were about to snap under the sheer stupid pressure of the man. Doubt, cold and sharp, flickered in Bruce's mind. I miscalculated. He's too heavy. The human body was not designed for this. He could feel the ligaments in his back stretching to their absolute breaking point. Then, Crosby's breath hitched. The downward force the wrestler was applying suddenly became a liability. Because Bruce had wedged himself so deeply underneath, Crosby's own rigid posture worked against him. He couldn't bend. He couldn't absorb the shock. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the gym as the floorboards protested the sudden shift in pressure. Bruce roared, not a theatrical shout, but a primal, involuntary expulsion of air from deep within his diaphragm. He drove his legs straight, exploding upward with every ounce of raw, unrefined power he possessed. The massive wrestler's eyes bulged. The smugness evaporated, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. Crosby's thick arms flailed outward, desperately seeking purchase on empty air. Friction broke. Crosby Dawson's right boot tore away from the canvas with a loud squeak. A millisecond later, his left boot followed. The immovable mountain was no longer touching the ground. He was airborne. Bruce felt the sudden, terrifying lack of resistance. The 400 pounds was fully loaded onto his frame now, suspended entirely by his skeletal alignment and the explosive momentum of his upward drive. He didn't just lift Crosby, he vaulted him. For one agonizing, impossible second, Crosby hovered. He was a whale breached above the ocean, utterly helpless, his massive legs kicking empty air, his face pale and contorted in shock. Bruce didn't hold him there. He couldn't. The strain was agonizing. With a sharp twist of his hips, Bruce redirected the momentum sideways, stepping out from under the falling mass. Crosby came crashing down. The impact was deafening. The entire boxing ring shuddered, the ropes violently shaking, dust leaping off the canvas in a gray cloud. The sound was like a car being dropped from a crane. Crosby hit the mat flat on his back, the air exploding from his lungs in a wet, ragged gasp. Silence slammed into the warehouse. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed deafening. Adam Alvarez's unlit cigar dropped from his slack jaw, bouncing softly on the ring apron. The cynical audience sat, frozen in their folding chairs, beers halfway to their mouths, eyes wide with incomprehension. Bruce stood over the gasping giant. He didn't strike a pose. He didn't look triumphant. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving as he stared down at his own trembling hands. His lower back was throbbing with a hot, sharp pain that promised misery for the next week. He wiped a bead of cold perspiration from his temple, his expression souring. He looked at the crowd, then down at the wheezing mountain on the floor. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt incredibly, exhaustingly human. Physics, Bruce whispered to no one in particular, his voice raspy and thin. Just physics. Coughing broke the suffocating silence. It was a wet, ragged sound, tearing from the back of Crosby Dawson's throat as he fought to pull oxygen past his paralyzed diaphragm. He lay flat on his back, staring up at the flickering fluorescent tubes. The mythology of the immovable mountain had been shattered, reduced to 400 pounds of bruised meat and confused nerves. Nobody cheered. The audience remained frozen in their folding metal chairs, trapped in a collective state of cognitive dissonance. They had come to watch a physics equation validate their worldview. Big rock crushes small stone. What they had just witnessed felt like a glitch in reality. A man the size of a commercial refrigerator had been unmoored from the earth by a guy who looked like he barely ate carbohydrates. A single metallic clatter echoed from the back of the room as someone dropped a beer bottle. The sound broke the spell. Murmurs started, low and frantic, buzzing like agitated hornets. Still, there was no applause. People don't applaud when you strip away their certainties. They argue. Men in cheap leather jackets leaned over empty rows of chairs, pointing angrily at the ring, their voices overlapping in harsh, skeptical tones. He must have tripped. The floorboards gave out. It was a setup. Bruce heard none of it. His entire universe had shrunk to the searing electric wire of pain vibrating at the base of his spine. The adrenaline dump was crashing hard, leaving a cold, metallic taste in the back of his mouth. He kept his face entirely neutral, a mask of carved ivory, but underneath the skin, his lower lumbar muscles were spasming in violent microscopic contractions. He had generated too much torque. His skeletal structure had handled the load, but the soft tissue was demanding a brutal tax. He looked down at Crosby. The giant was rolling onto his side, a massive, trembling hand clutching his chest. Up close, stripped of his arrogant posture, Crosby just looked incredibly tired. The coarse blonde hair on his arms was plastered flat with cold perspiration. His lips were pale. For a fraction of a second, Bruce felt a sharp pang of revulsion. Not toward the wrestler, but toward himself. Why had he done it? To prove a point to a room full of men who would never understand the mechanics of what they just saw anyway. To satisfy a fragile, jagged edge of his own ego. He had compromised his physical health for a parlor trick. Adam Alvarez shattered the quiet intimacy of the ring. The promoter scrambled under the ropes, his synthetic suit jacket riding up his back, his face flushed with the greedy, frantic energy of a man who just found a winning lottery ticket in the gutter. "Jesus Christ!" Adam barked, his voice loud enough to cut through the crowd's grumbling. He rushed toward Bruce, arms wide. The sharp stench of his wintergreen cologne and stale tobacco rolled off him in waves. "Did you see that? Did you animals see that?" Autumn screamed at the audience, his eyes wide and manic. Autumn grabbed Bruce's right arm, hoisting it into the air in a crude pantomime of victory. The physical contact was repulsive. Bruce yanked his arm down with a sharp, violent snap. Autumn stumbled back, surprised, his oily smile faltering for a microsecond before returning. "Don't touch me," Bruce said. His voice was a quiet, deadly rasp, entirely swallowed by the ambient noise of the gym, meant only for the promoter. "Hey, play the part, kid!" Autumn hissed back, leaning in close, his breath hot and unpleasant against Bruce's ear. "We just made history. I can sell this. We'll do a tour. The man who moved the mountain. Think of the gate receipts, Bruce. Think of the press." Bruce turned his back on the promoter. He walked over to Crosby, who had managed to push himself up onto one knee. The wrestler was panting heavily, his massive chest heaving. The sheer mechanical effort required just to lift his own torso off the canvas looked agonizing. Crosby didn't look up. He stared intently at the scuffed white canvas between his enormous hands. Humiliation radiated off him, an almost palpable heat. He had built his entire identity, his livelihood, on being an unmovable object. He had sold that certainty for 3 years. In 3 seconds, it had been dismantled. Bruce crouched down, ignoring the sharp spike of agony in his lower back as his knees bent. He didn't offer a hand. Offering a hand to a man that size was a hollow gesture, an insult disguised as sportsmanship. Crosby didn't need physical help. He needed the dignity of his own gravity. "Your stance," Bruce said quietly, his tone flat, completely devoid of mockery or triumph. Crosby finally raised his head. His small eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a volatile mixture of anger and profound confusion. "You relied on dead weight," Bruce continued, keeping his voice below the noise of the crowd. "Dead weight is just an object waiting to be lifted. You locked your knees. You made yourself a solid piece of timber. Timber doesn't bend, it breaks." Crosby swallowed hard. He looked at Bruce, searching the smaller man's face for a smirk, for the gloating sneer that Crosby himself would have worn. He found nothing. Just a tired, pained expression on a man who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. "How?" Crosby rumbled, his voice cracking slightly, sounding incredibly small coming from such a vast chest. "I had you by 80 pounds on the grip alone." "Leverage," Bruce whispered. "I wasn't lifting you, Crosby. I was using the floor to push you out of my way." Bruce stood up, the movement stiff and heavily controlled to mask the radiating pain in his spine. He didn't wait for Crosby to fully stand. He didn't wait for Autumn to announce a winner. He walked away from the center of the ring, ducking smoothly through the ropes, his flat-soled shoes landing softly on the concrete floor outside the apron. The crowd parted for him. It wasn't out of respect. It was the uneasy, superstitious distance people give to something they don't comprehend. He walked through the sea of leather jackets and cigar smoke, his eyes fixed on the heavy steel door at the back of the warehouse. He felt their stares dragging against his back, heavy and ignorant. The locker room was a damp, windowless concrete box that smelled strongly of industrial bleach, mildew, and rotting leather. A single caged bulb cast harsh yellow shadows against the cinder-block walls. Bruce sat on a splintering wooden bench, staring at the raw concrete floor. The silence back here was thick, insulated from the echoing warehouse by heavy cinder blocks. Only the rhythmic metallic ping of water dripping from a rusted showerhead broke the quiet. Slowly, methodically, Bruce began to strip off the thin canvas shoes. Every time he bent forward, a hot wire of pain pulled taut across his lower back. He closed his eyes, inhaling the damp, stale air, focusing on isolating the sensation. It wasn't a severe tear, but it was a deep muscle strain. He had pushed the structural integrity of his own joints to the absolute edge. He stood up and peeled off his soaked shirt, tossing it onto the bench with a damp slap. He walked over to the cracked mirror hanging precariously above a stained porcelain sink. The reflection staring back at him wasn't a mythical dragon. It was just a man. He noted the slight asymmetry in his posture, his body instinctively tilting to the left to take the pressure off his inflamed right lumbar. His knuckles were bruised, the skin scraped raw from the abrasive friction of Crosby's heavy canvas belt. Vanity, Bruce thought bitterly, turning on the cold water tap. He splashed the freezing water onto his face, gasping slightly at the shock. You traded a piece of your body for an audience that doesn't even know what they are looking at. The heavy metal door groaned on its hinges. Bruce didn't turn around. He watched in the cracked mirror as Crosby Dawson filled the doorway. The giant had to duck his head and turn his massive shoulders slightly sideways to clear the frame. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt that looked like a canvas tarp, dark patches of moisture blossoming under the arms and down the collar. Crosby limped heavily. His right knee, the one that had borne the brunt of the twisting fall, was wrapped tightly in a thick layer of white athletic tape. He carried a plastic bag filled with crushed ice in one hand. The locker room, which had felt claustrophobic before, suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Crosby stopped a few feet from the bench. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood there, breathing heavily, the sound whistling through his broken nose. He looked at Bruce's back, noticing the pronounced unnatural tension in the smaller man's musculature. "You're hurt," Crosby stated. It wasn't a question. Bruce grabbed a rough, thin towel from his bag and dried his face. A strain. The torque was excessive. Crosby let out a short, humorless grunt. He limped over to the opposite bench and let his massive frame crash down onto the wood. The bench shrieked in protest. Crosby pressed the bag of ice against his ribs, wincing sharply. "I thought I crushed my own lungs when I hit that mat," Crosby said, his voice quiet, stripped of all the bravado that had filled the arena 20 minutes prior. I've never been off my feet, not since I was a teenager. I didn't know what to do with my hands. Bruce turned around, leaning his hips back against the cold porcelain of the sink. He looked at Crosby. The monster was gone. The intimidating aura had completely evaporated, leaving behind a profoundly embarrassed, physically broken 34-year-old man who made a living letting people treat him like a circus animal. You panicked, Bruce said gently. When your base was removed, your brain couldn't process the lack of friction. You tried to brace against the air. Crosby nodded slowly, staring at the floor. Yeah, I felt like I was falling off a building. He paused, shifting the ice pack, his thick fingers trembling slightly. Adam was out there, trying to book me for a rematch in Chicago, telling the crowd I slipped on a wet patch. Adam is a parasite, Bruce said, his voice hardening. He feeds on the spectacle. He doesn't care about the art. He doesn't care about your knee or my spine. To him, we are just meat colliding for loose change. Crosby looked up, meeting Bruce's eyes. For the first time all night, there was an understanding between them. It wasn't the cliché, respectful nod of noble warriors. It was the grim, shared recognition of two men trapped in the same absurd, degrading industry. Two men who sold pieces of their physical health to entertain people who would step over them if they bled out on the street. "You're not going to take his tour?" Crosby asked. Bruce picked up his canvas duffel bag. He zipped it closed, the sound harsh and loud in the quiet room. He threw the strap over his left shoulder to avoid straining his back further. "No," Bruce said. "There is no truth in a circus, only tricks." He walked toward the door. As he passed Crosby, he stopped for a fraction of a second. He could smell the sharp tang of the ice, the sour sweat, the very human exhaustion rolling off the massive man. "Keep the knee elevated tonight, Crosby," Bruce said softly. "And next time someone tells you to be a mountain, remember that mountains can't move." Bruce pushed through the heavy steel door, stepping out into the cold, damp air of the alley behind the warehouse. The night smelled of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. He walked toward his car, his footsteps completely silent, carrying the weight of the victory like a stone in his shoe. Did the physics of Bruce's explosive technique blow your mind? That's what happens when raw biomechanics meet human willpower. If you loved this deep dive into one of martial arts' most misunderstood moments, hit that like button to feed the algorithm and share it with someone who still thinks mass beats leverage. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another breakdown. What legendary martial arts myth should we dissect next? Drop a comment below.